the death of his father, King Farouk the Perverse, in 1936, he left Britain, where he was educated, to return to Egypt. Meanwhile, in the royal yacht, ex-King Farouk has gone into exile, while the future of Egypt and her relations with the West are questions still to be resolved.
In the spring of 1953, the new revolutionary government of Egypt opened the private apartments of King Farouk the First to the international press. Journalists were walked through the master bedroom of the deposed monarch. They were shown what the Free Officers state media described on the record as the largest collection of pornography ever assembled by a single human being. Time magazine published an extensive feature, the image of King Farouk as a degenerate, sex-obsessed satyr, a man whose private life had been so depraved that his violent overthrow was not a coup but a moral necessity, was, within months, fixed permanently in the global cultural memory. For 70 years, that image has remained the dominant portrait of the penultimate king of Egypt. There is, however, a problem with the story. It is, in significant part, untrue. The most damning items had been deliberately placed there for the cameras. Modern historians describe the collection as nothing terribly offensive. This is the story of how a revolutionary government invented a pervert. The Sheltered Heir. Farouk bin Ahmed Fuad was born on the 11th of February 1920, the eldest child of King Fuad I and Queen Nazli Sabri. His upbringing was psychologically damaging. King Fuad kept his heir extraordinarily isolated. Farouk was permitted to see his own mother for only 1 hour a day. He lived 12 miles from the pyramids of Giza and did not visit them until he became king. He was treated with a sycophantic reverence that included servants kissing the ground before he walked across it, an instilling of divine right at an age when most children are learning to share toys. He had a near savant aptitude for languages, Arabic, English, French, Italian, Turkish, but his formal education was a disaster. Sent to England in 1935 to prepare for Woolwich, he failed twice. He returned to Egypt in 1936 when his father died. He was 16. He inherited the throne, a personal fortune of 100 million American dollars, 5 palaces, 200 automobiles, 2 royal yachts, and 75,000 acres of the most fertile land in the Nile Valley. The early Egyptian public adored him. Slim, handsome, fluent in their language, he was widely called the beloved king. The transformation from beloved king to caricature of decadence would take less than a decade. The Abdeen Humiliation. The decisive event of King Farouk's reign, the psychological hinge of his entire trajectory, occurred on the 4th of February, 1942. Egypt was technically independent, but functionally still under British colonial supervision. The Second World War was raging across North Africa. Axis forces under Rommel were advancing toward the Suez Canal. The British government decided to remove all ambiguity about who was actually in charge. The British ambassador, Sir Miles Lampson, ordered a column of British tanks and heavily armed troops to surround the Abdeen Palace. He then walked into the king's office and presented him with an ultimatum. Farouk had 2 choices. He could appoint the pro-British Waft Party leader Nahas Pasha as prime minister, or he could sign an instrument of abdication on the spot. Farouk capitulated. The young king, 22 years old, surrounded by foreign tanks in his own capital, signed the appointment. The political damage was immediate and irreversible. The Egyptian public, the Egyptian military, and the Egyptian political class all witnessed the same thing. Their sovereign was not, in any meaningful sense, sovereign. The British could remove him at will. The throne was, beneath its ceremonial gilding, a colonial fiction. The young reformer who had been hailed as the beloved king effectively vanished. In his place was a man who had been publicly emasculated by a foreign power, and who, from that point forward, retreated into the sphere where he could still exercise unchallenged authority: the private, the personal, the consumptive. The documented eccentricities. What King Farouk actually did during the decade after Abdeen is documented in extensive detail by the British Foreign Office, by diplomatic cables, by the international press, and by global auction records. He developed a serious case of kleptomania. He did not steal because he needed to. He was one of the wealthiest individuals on the planet. He stole for the act of stealing itself. In August 1942, 6 months after Abdeen, Farouk hosted Winston Churchill at a wartime meeting in Cairo. During the meeting, Farouk pickpocketed Churchill's pocket watch directly from the Prime Minister's waistcoat. When Churchill discovered the theft, Farouk produced the watch and returned it, framing the incident as a practical joke. He had reportedly learned the technique by pardoning an imprisoned Egyptian pickpocket on the condition that the man teach him sleight of hand. In 1944, when the body of Reza Shah Pahlavi was transported through Egypt for burial, Farouk reportedly stole the ceremonial sword from the deceased monarch's coffin. His material acquisitions were extraordinary. He assembled one of the greatest private coin collections in human history, over 8,500 numismatic pieces, including the famously rare 1933 American Double Eagle. He owned over 100 luxury automobiles, including a Mercedes-Benz 540K, personally gifted by Adolf Hitler for his 1938 wedding. He decreed that all royal vehicles be painted red and forbade the local police from stopping any red car in Egypt. His food consumption became the subject of international tabloid commentary. He was reported to eat upwards of 600 oysters a week, and his weight rose to nearly 300 pounds. The underlying medical reality was a documented case of severe bulimia compounded by genetic predisposition. This portrait, a flawed, compulsive, self-indulgent, politically disengaged monarch, is the verifiable Farouk. It is also not the portrait that has come down to history, the free officer's coup. By the early 1950s, the Egyptian state had become structurally untenable. The catastrophic defeat in the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, fueled in part by defective weaponry through corrupt palace-linked contractors, had destroyed the monarchy's military legitimacy. The young Egyptian officers who had fought in that war returned to Cairo with an unforgiving diagnosis. Their king was not a sovereign. He was a liability. A clandestine organization calling itself the Free Officers had been forming inside the Egyptian military since the late 1940s. Its nominal leader was General Mohammed Naguib. Its actual ideological center was a colonel named Gamal Abdel Nasser. On the 23rd of July, 1952, following the breakdown of order during the Black Saturday riots, the Free Officers executed a bloodless coup. 3 days later, King Farouk was surrounded at the Montaza Palace in Alexandria. He was forced to abdicate in favor of his infant son, who became Fuad II. Farouk fled Egypt aboard the royal yacht Mahrusa, taking with him 60 suitcases of personal possessions and, according to later accounts, gold bars cleverly packed in crates labeled as alcoholic beverages. He spent the remainder of his life in exile across Capri, Rome, and Monaco. He had been deposed. The new government still had a problem: the 1953 palace exhibitions. The problem facing the free officers was that King Farouk, despite his unpopularity, still retained residual sympathy among portions of the Egyptian population, particularly the conservative peasantry and traditional elite. A military overthrow of a sitting Muslim monarch required, in mid-century Egypt, more than political justification. It required moral justification. The free officers manufactured one. In the spring of 1953, the revolutionary government opened the private apartments of King Farouk to the international press. The official narrative, distributed through state media, was unambiguous. The new government had discovered, in their words, warehouses full of pornography. They described it as the largest such collection ever assembled by a single individual. The Western press largely ran the story as presented. Time magazine, however, sent its own correspondent. The resulting feature describes what the journalist actually saw. The bedroom, the Time correspondent wrote, was heaped with a strange mixture of pornography, childishness, and sentimentality. The pornography itself, on closer inspection, consisted largely of mild glamour shots of the kind used to advertise Chicago burlesque clubs. There were trick photographs of fan dancers that appeared to move when squeezed. There were 2 stacks of well-thumbed American comic books. There were innocent bridal photographs of his ex-wife, Queen Nariman. That was the warehouse of pornography. Modern historians have been blunt. Roger Owen described the contents as nothing terribly offensive: classical nude artwork and ornate watches with mildly bawdy mechanisms, the kind of mid-century aristocratic indulgences entirely common across European nobility. Arthur Goldschmidt Jr. observed that the documentation supporting the deviancy narrative would not, in his words, pass muster in a court of law. Farouk himself, writing from exile, contested the exhibition directly. He claimed the most damning items, a pistol, and an album of semi-nude photographs, prominently visible from beneath his pillows in the published images, had been deliberately planted by the free officers for the photographers. Upon this strange assortment, he wrote mockingly, "I was supposed to sleep each night." The contemporaneous testimony of the women involved with him is more deflationary. Barbara Skelton, one of his documented mistresses, rejected the predator narrative explicitly. She described Farouk as endearing, incredibly sweet, and almost childlike, a man who preferred to hold hands and cuddle in the palace screening room. This is not the testimony of women describing a monster. The mechanics of the smear. To understand why the free officers needed the warehouse of pornography story to be true, you have to understand what they were actually doing during the same period. They were liquidating his assets. In February 1954, the new government contracted the British auction house Sotheby's to sell the contents of the royal palaces. The auction was titled, with careful neutrality, "The Palace Collections of Egypt." The stated public purpose was to replenish the Egyptian national treasury with the wealth the deposed monarch had supposedly looted from the people. The Egyptian military did not have the specialized expertise to properly value what it had seized. The military relied on hasty appraisals. The lots were heavily consolidated. They were poorly marketed. The collection sold for an estimated 10% of its true market value. Numismatic experts evaluating Farouk's coin collection alone, using modern auction comparables, have estimated it would be worth over 150 million American dollars in today's market. The Egyptian state received a small fraction of that figure. The narrative of the perverted king served a specific purpose. As long as the public believed the assets being sold belonged to a degenerate who had stolen them from the nation, the question of how those assets were being valued, who was buying them, and whether the public was actually receiving fair compensation became politically untouchable. To question the auction was to defend the pervert. Though the smear is often described as propaganda, the more precise word is instrument. It served financial, political, and cultural purposes simultaneously. This is the historiographical pattern scholars have identified across multiple 20th century cases. A revolutionary regime overthrows a flawed but legally legitimate predecessor. The new regime requires retroactive moral justification. The most efficient form of justification is one that mobilizes existing cultural anxieties, religious, sexual, familial, into a coherent narrative of degeneracy. The deposed leader is not just incompetent, he is unclean. He is unforgivable. What the record actually shows. King Farouk died on the 18th of March 1965 at the Ile-de-France restaurant in Rome. He was 45 years old. He had just finished a characteristically heavy meal. He suffered a massive heart attack at the table. Though his exile companions suspected poisoning by Egyptian intelligence, no forensic evidence ever surfaced. Severe bulimia, morbid obesity, decades of chain smoking, and relentless stress provided a fully sufficient explanation. When the man who had once possessed an estimated billion-dollar empire was searched at the time of his death, the contents of his pockets totaled 155 American dollars. Nasser initially refused to allow his body to be repatriated to Egypt, fearing a royal funeral might function as a rallying point. He eventually relented. Farouk was buried quietly at the Al-Rifa'i Mosque in Cairo. Biographer William Stadium observed that Farouk's defining sin was aesthetic rather than moral. He was, in Stadium's phrasing, fat and bald rather than telegenic. He photographed badly. He made a perfect caricature. Modern Egyptian historiography is not absolving Farouk of his actual political failures. The Abdeen capitulation was real. The 1948 defeat was real. The kleptomania, the gluttony, and the political disengagement were all real. But the perverted king, the warehouse of pornography, and the harem of imagined captives are now broadly recognized as a deliberate state-sponsored fabrication serving the foundational myths of the 1952 revolution. The most important lesson is not about Farouk himself. It is about the architecture of political memory, about the techniques by which a successor regime constructs the moral pretext for its predecessor's removal, and about how readily the international press will reproduce that pretext as fact. King Farouk was, by every documented measure, a flawed and self-indulgent monarch. The version of him that has dominated the global historical memory for 70 years was, in significant part, a fiction. The most famous thing about the last true king of Egypt was the thing that was largely invented by the men who removed him,